Hello, and welcome to a discussion on graphs and figures in APA 7. So, like many things, there's a lot of specificity that goes into adding things into a paper in APA. So, they need to be done a particular way, right? It's not just stick something on it, say figure one, and call it good. There's a mechanism that needs to be done. So, stating the obvious, tables are for tabular data, such as a list of textual values or numeric values. Figures are going to be basically everything else. So, things that are graphics, charts, diagrams, a graph, a graph, any kind of visual representation, really. It may have something to do with data, it may not. But the guidelines are very similar for both, the main difference being the word table or figure. So when you're dealing with a figure, and tables would be very similar, there are some elements that you need to be aware of. First, they have a name that's up at the top. Anytime you see a figure in a document, it should have a number, and that's essentially naming it. It also has a title. So you give it a meaningful title, similar to a title that you might give to something, say, like a book, right? So it needs to be descriptive. It needs to explain at a glance what the data is about. Such here, we're talking about changes in work attitude as a function of day and time. And then you also need to make sure you label axes if you have them. So X and Y axis needs to be labeled with a title as well. There needs to be numbers. And in certain situations, you may need to make sure to call out a key. So you may need to say what the values are. And then also, again, naming the labels, the labels on the axes and so on. In certain situations, you may need to add a figure note. It really is going to depend upon either the complexity of the figure, and if it's something that needs to be done that way. There's also a case of referencing somebody else's figure. So if you're not creating it yourself from scratch, if you're not making the figure yourself, you need to cite that figure, or you may have just committed plagiarism. So keep this in mind. Figures there's a way of doing it. It's a thing. You need to be very careful and thoughtful of how you do it. This is one thing that I see grading papers that almost no students get right. In part, if you're not using a template that has this capability built in, you're going to do it using probably something like Microsoft Word's functionality, and you're going to do it incorrectly. I mean, you'll put the figure name at the bottom or whatever. So keep in mind, it does need to be done a certain way. Here's a great link at the bottom of the page that my head is definitely on. So APA style .apa.org, and then /style grammar guidelines with dashes in between the words, then table dash figures, and then figures. So spend a little bit of time, look at it. It's a thing. It needs to be studied as though it were its own sort of discipline. One thing that I've said repeatedly whenever I was getting my doctorate is I was not getting a doctorate of computer science. I was getting a doctorate of APA, because there are so many things that need to be done in a certain way. Whenever you're creating a figure, you want to make sure that you're creating it in a way that is easy to understand. This is true of any kind of graphical representation, especially true in APA, because the whole point of scholarly writing and using APA is to be as clear as we possibly can, to be very concise, precise, and so on. You want to make sure that the information can be done, the figures, the most concise way to do it, or so on. Also make sure that whenever you're looking at that figure, you know what it means without reading the text. You still need to cite it from the text. Don't include figures without referencing to them by name. So as shown in figure one or whatever. It's important that you make sure that you call them out from the narrative of the paper, but not just that. Don't rely on somebody reading it to understand it. They should be able to glance at the figure and say, oh, I know what this means, right? And whenever you're doing it, the basic standards are it's got to be clear, you've got to have smooth lines, it's got to be legible, And that's going to also depend upon what the final thing is going to be in. If it's something that's like a manuscript that's being submitted to a graduate level course, it's less of a concern because it's likely going to be read on a screen, higher resolution, and so on. If it's something that's going to go to print, you definitely want to spend some time thinking about it, making sure that you get that right. You want to make sure that the unit of measure is provided and is clear and is consistent. You don't be changing units of measure to make something be misleading. The whole point of graphics and figures is to unambiguously and dispassionately explain something to the reader. You're not there to make a case, you're there to help them understand. Make sure the axes are labeled clearly, and also make sure that the figure just makes sense. You do want to be creating your graphics in some sort of thing, be it Excel or whatever. You can also use things like Photoshop and Inkscape if it's more complex. But anymore, even things like PowerPoint and Word have ways of building figures built straight in. When you place the paper, you have kind of two options when you're dealing with figures and tables, right? The first is to embed the figure in the text after its first mention or call out. The second is to place them all on a separate page in the reference list. Generally, embedding makes it a little easier. It may take up a large portion of the page. If it's relatively short, it may just be injected in between. Don't have the text doing any wrapping or any of that stuff, right? You're just putting the figure in just as it looked back here, right? This is literally what it would look like. This is your page, and it's just a question of if there's text around it or not. That's the main difference. So you oftentimes want to think about that, but don't assume that, especially if you're writing the paper for publication, that you know where it's at. So don't reference as shown below in the narrative. Refer to it by its number, figure 1, as figure 1 demonstrates, or figure 1, it doesn't actually do anything. So as is represented in the graphic in figure 1 or something. You also want to make sure that there's a blank double-spaced line between the figure and the text so that it's easy to read. So they do need to be done a certain way. This is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, of tables and figures. There's a whole lot more to learn. The key thing to understand, there's a certain way to do it. There is a wrong way to do it. Most people get it wrong. This is one of those things you have to get right if you want to do well in graduate school, especially in a school that's using APA. As always, thank you for watching. I look forward to talking with you again.